everybody, Dr. Rob Silverman here. I'm here with the father of functional medicine, Dr. Jeffrey Bland. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Jeffrey Bland, though he needs no introduction. He was without question aligned with Linus Pauling, a two-time Nobel Prize laureate. He's written multiple books, I think over 120 peer-reviewed journals. And as I said before, he's the father of functional medicine. I am here talking and helping people because I saw Dr. Bland talk. He changed my metrics. He gave me a credo. Nobody does it better than Dr. Jeffrey Bland.
Wow. Well, you've set a big standard here, Dr. Silverman. So, gee whiz, I feel like I have to jump a little higher. Thanks for the opportunity.
Now, we don't need to make you jump. We just are happy to hear you. We're happy to hear your insights. We've got a specific topic that we want to delve into. We want to know, what are bioflavonoids? Because I have heard you talk about them so much. And why are they so crucial for good overall health?
You know, this is kind of becoming the Back to the Future new exposed secret. And the reason I say Back to the Future is that these class of nutrients were actually discovered by a Nobel Prize winner in his own right. It was a friend of Dr. Pauling. It was actually the Nobel Prize that was won for the discovery of vitamin C. And that Nobel Prize winner, when he discovered vitamin C, and by the way that he did that was very interesting because at the point where this is the early 1900s, people were trying to find out the substance in food that would prevent scurvy. And no one could actually isolate what that nutritional principle was. And he, being from Hungary, knew that paprika, which is a common spice used in food in that culture, was reasonably good in preventing scurvy. And so he thought, well, maybe paprika would be high in this anti-scorbutic factor. So he then was able to isolate the first crystalline vitamin C from paprika that the world had ever seen. Had never seen this anti-scorbutic factor isolated from a food. And the test animal that he used to study its anti-scurvy properties was the guinea pig, because it turns out the guinea pig doesn't make vitamin C, like we don't make vitamin C. So it's an animal model for scurvy. And by the way, this is where the whole kind of concept of being a guinea pig came from, was out of this vitamin C work. You know, people say, oh, you want to be a guinea pig? Well, that really came out of this vitamin C work. And so he ultimately then was able to show that this very small amount of this crystalline material that he said was anti-scorbutic, so ascorbic acid, vitamin C, that's what it's called, ascorbic acid, was capable of preventing this dreaded disease that had killed, you know, thousands and thousands of people over time because they didn't have vitamin C in their diet, particularly people like sailors and people that are away from land-based plants for a long period of time. And it was actually the Scottish surgeon, Robert Lind, who was working about the same time as James Cook, they were friends actually, that actually informed James Cook to a study that he had done showing that if you were to take citrus, you could prevent scurvy. This is the whole thing about the British limeys, right? Because limeys were the people were given a ration of these anti-scorbutic foods containing vitamin C that allowed the Brits to be the first to discover the Pacific Basin and be able to come back and tell the story because people didn't die of scurvy. Before that, explorers from Spain and Italy and Portugal and France had problems because, yeah, people could get over into the Pacific theater, but they didn't live to come back and tell about it because the crews of these ships often would all die from scurvy. So this history of ascorbutic was interesting. Now, how does that relate to this concept of flavonoids? Well, it turns out that when you purify from, in this case, paprika, the anti-scorbutic factor, vitamin C, it becomes a crystalline white, pure powder material, crystalline material. But when it's given to these guinea pigs, they get over scurvy, but they don't get entirely well. They're still partially unwell. What he found was that if he used a slightly impure fraction of the purification from paprika of vitamin C, so it had a kind of a yellowish tinge to it. It wasn't completely pure and he gave that to the guinea pigs, they got completely well.
Wow.
So then it raised the question in his mind, well, what else is in there besides vitamin C that's making this color? Maybe there's some impurity that potentiates vitamin C or has an additional value. And so when he studied that as a chemist, he was able to determine that, lo and behold, it was a new class of molecules, not like vitamin C in terms of structure. And he called that vitamin P. And the reason he called it vitamin P was that when he gave that substance to animals, it would prevent bruising, it would prevent capillaries from breaking down, it would prevent blood flow problems in animals. And so the P stood for permeability. It prevented permeability. It prevented the permeable of blood leaking out of blood vessels and causing bruising or hemorrhage. And so he called it vitamin P. Well, then further research on this, people said, well, it's not really a true vitamin. And so after years of debate in the nutrition field, they decided, okay, we're not going to call it vitamin P, we're going to call it substance P.
Mm.
And substance P was the first name that was given to then what later chemists found the structure were flavonoids, these bioflavonoids. And there's now, since then, we recognize that there are over 9,000 different flavonoids in different foods, 9,000 different ones. And they're basically the molecules that are related to the production of color in fruits and vegetables. So we know that when we're eating a diet that has adequate levels of fruits and vegetables, by the basis of the color of the food, whether it's yellow or red or orange or blue or purple, that those individual flavonoids impart different colors based upon the families of the molecules they belong to, and they all have different potential physiological effects on the body. And so for years, now here's where the story I think gets quite interesting. People knew this kind of history that I just shared with you, but they didn't think that these molecules that called flavonoids were all that important because you couldn't find a specific deficiency disease associated with their absence. So you couldn't say, like you do with vitamin C, scurvy, or with niacin pellagra, or beriberi with vitamin B1. So because there was no deficiency, people said, well, maybe they're not that important. They just come along with plants, but we don't need to worry about them. And so in nutrition textbooks that trained nutrition professionals for decades in the United States, every nutrition textbook had maybe a couple of pages, sometimes maybe just a few paragraphs about flavonoids. They were considered kind of nutritional flotsam and jetsam. They weren't considered important until the last few years. And now it was like why I said Back to the Future. They've been rediscovered in light of the new science of nutrigenetics, the new science of epigenomics. The new science has found out that these molecules that we've been kind of marginalizing and actually taking out of our food when we process it because we either didn't want the color or we didn't want the taste profile, so we made the foods like from starch, very able to be sweetened and put fat in them to be flavored any way we wanted, so they didn't carry any of the original characteristics of the original plant from which they were derived. Now we recognize that that was actually doing a disservice to the nutrition quality. And if you actually look at the blue zone areas of the world where people have unusually long longevities and low level of intervention with modern medicine, one of the principles of all of their diets, no matter where in the world you look at blue zones, is they eat high diets rich in flavonoids. And in fact, even a region of the blue zones that is called Loma Linda, California. Now, Loma Linda, California is not like Vilcabamba. It's not like Icaria. It's not like Costa Rica. It's not like the Philippines. These are areas that are blue zones. But you would say, well, those are people eating a traditional diet, that goes way back when. What about people who live in Loma Linda? That is in Los Angeles County. It drinks the same water, breathes the same air as everyone else in Los Angeles County. But the difference is that people who live in Loma Linda live on average 16 years longer without disease. They are genetically heterogeneous. They're not all from one gene family, but yet they have within the same community that other people are dying early, they're still alive and well. Now, why? Because they are Seventh-day Adventists. that is a Seventh-day Adventist community. They believe in vegetable-based diets, vegetarianism. And if you look at their flavonoid intake, it is very, very high, like these other countries, Icaria in Greece, or you go to Vilcabamba in the Himalayas, or you go to Costa Rica. The levels that you find in those blue zone countries where people are eating these natural diets are the same in flavonoids as people that are living in Loma Linda. So this story has really taken off as to how do these molecules work in the body? What is their specific way that they create these beneficial health effects? And are all flavonoids the same, or do we have differential effects based upon differential foods that carry different flavonoids in their composition? And it is a revolution in new discovery. And it is changing the whole fabric of nutrition right now. It's a magnificent time to be alive because we're learning back to the future what our historical ancestors might have known that we forgot and processed out of our food.
It is without question a beautiful time to be alive, and so many things every day. I mean, I can't emphasize enough to the listeners that you got the ball rolling. You got the ball rolling of the idea of functional medicine, which is looking not at symptoms, but systems, not looking at disease, but healthcare, looking at the idea of root cause resolution, looking for an answer. And I think a lot of what you just said really allows the bioflavonoids to encapsulate that vision that you have. Because what did you say? Well, you talked about longevity, which is the incisive conversation of 2023, 24, and for next year without question. In addition to that, you talked about the blue zones. Now, what was real interesting, I thought a very salient point was the colors of the fruit will depict the different properties they have. So if we could coin a pal of ours, we could say you want to eat from the food rainbow. Also, I think that it begs the question to piggyback a little bit on what you said. Give me 3 specific things, if I were to ask you, 3 to 5 things of the properties that bioflavonoids provide.
Yes, thank you. That's a really great question. And by the way, when we talk about Eat the Rainbow, I want to give attribution to a dear colleague of mine who I have tremendous respect for, Dr. Deanna Minnick. Dr. Minnick has done a pioneering job in really bringing this concept of eating the rainbow so you get the variety of these beneficial substances into your diet, and kind of making it easy to think about when you go to the store, saying, well, I'm going to pick several items that have natural colors, so different colors, and I'm going to incorporate them in my diet. It makes it kind of a simple in recipe and menu planning. But let's talk about what are the benefits that we see from these flavonoids, and why would you be interested in including them in your diet? Well, first of all, and historically, they have been known as antioxidants. And in fact, if you were to read the contemporary literature on flavonoids, probably the major discussion would be around their role that they serve as antioxidants. But I always was somewhat, I guess, questioning about that is the singular activity of these family of nutrients, because it turns out that their antioxidant capability is not directly related to their effect on cell biology health. So yes, they're antioxidants, but you cannot track exactly their benefit in health to their antioxidant potential. So there's something more than just being an antioxidant. There's something, and when I say antioxidant, just to remind people what I'm speaking of, that these are things that quench these damaging oxygen substances that cause rancidity, cause injury to molecules, cause injury to DNA. They're called free radicals. I'm not talking politically here, I'm talking chemically. These molecules are very promiscuous when they're formed in the body, and they go out and they injure other parts of your body's matrix. Could be proteins, could be nucleic acids, could be carbohydrates, and could be fats. And so these particular molecules, if they're not controlled properly, these free radical oxidants, can be injurious, and they're associated with biological aging, and they're associated with virtually every chronic disease. This concept of inflammation and oxidants. So antioxidants are there to quench them, to diffuse them, to make them harmless. And so this would be like, for instance, preventing rancidity of an oil. That would be an antioxidant property. And your body needs to have these antioxidants, and it has a whole system to do this, an enzyme system, a catalase, glutathione peroxidase, glutathione reductase. All these enzymes are there, superoxide dismutase, that regulate then the quenching of these free radicals in your body. And it is known that flavonoids participate in that process in a favorable way. So that's benefit one. But as I mentioned, you can't correlate directly the positive health effects that a specific flavonoid has based only on its antioxidant properties. There's something else going on. And so what is that? And people have done head scratching on that for some time and tried to understand what might be the other effects. And I feel very proud that our little research group recently has made our contribution. We put our oar in the water. We did a clinical study. We've done quite a bit of basic science research trying to understand exactly the mechanism by which these and certain flavonoids influence cell health. And I think we have uncovered something that now people are jumping on the bandwagon. There are many, many other scientists and clinicians that are working on this. And what is it? Well, we have found that these flavonoids, specific members of the flavonoid family, and remember I mentioned there are 9,000 different molecules in these families, so they are going into various functional structure-function relationships. But we have found that one of the dominant families of the flavonoids, which are called the polyphenols, the flavanols and flavonoids, that they have a specific influence on regulating how our genes express their message. Now, let me just sink that in for a second, because that's a pretty important concept. For more than 20 years now, I think probably actually more like 30 years, I've been saying that food is more than nutrients that give rise to energy. Food is also information for our genes. So when we eat, we're eating information. And our genes are reading that information and are then expressing their function based upon the information that our diet provides. So that is a concept called genetic expression, how our genes are actually expressing their function. Now, it's important to recall that we have the genes in our genome, 23 pairs of chromosomes, our book of life, that is only partially being read at any one time in any cell. You can imagine that if you were to read the full message of our book of life in every cell all the time, we'd be a mess, because the heart cell would be reading the kidney cell message, and the kidney cell would be reading the brain cell message. And if everyone was reading everybody else's message, we wouldn't be what we are, differentiated, healthy human beings. So that means that only certain parts of our book of life are being expressed at any one time in certain cells. What regulates that? So that basically the cell will only express the messages of good health and not express the messages of alarm or injury or fatigue. And so that regulatory process is called epigenetics, above the genes. Some factors that tell the genes, impart upon the genes, how they're going to regulate their expression into the function that ultimately makes us look and feel who we are. Well, it turns out that one of the major factors from our diet that speaks to our genes to regulate this epigenetic process are the flavonoids. This is a major, major change in our view of how flavonoids regulate function. So they basically become part of the executive shop, the executive centers of our body that are regulating downstream how our cells are functioning at the genetic level, how they're related to immune effects, how they're related to cell reparation, how they are related to cell repair, how they're related to cell injury. All of those things are ultimately, in part, regulated by this flavonoid component of our diet. Now, you might say, well, if this is so important, why wasn't this discovered long ago? And the reason I think it wasn't is that we didn't have the tools in science to be able to examine or interrogate this genetic process of epigenetics in a very detailed way until the last 10 or so years. So we didn't have the methods to actually do some of these studies. But maybe more importantly, I think the thing that held us back is that the absence of these flavonoids does not produce an immediate nutritional deficiency. It's not like, well, if you take the colored agents out of your diet, you only eat white, that you're going to the next month end up with a deficiency disease that we're going to call X, Y, or Z. It takes some time to accumulate the lower potential for your genes to express themselves in a less than desirable or optimal way, for that to accumulate the impacts that may occur over decades of living. And so that's why these compounds are so important for longevity, because they're regulating long-term functions that are related to how our genes in various cells are expressing themselves. And it's only really recently where we've had the ways of using animal models that age much quicker than we do because their life expectancies or lifespans are much shorter, that they've been able to start saying, well, hold it just a minute. In this animal model, which only lives for 3 years, which we can see these things happening much quicker than in a human, which lives maybe 70 to 100 years. And so this construct that these flavonoids participate in the regulation of function over time that give rise ultimately to things like immune defense, which is very subtle to when you get a cold and you don't know why. It's because your immune system wasn't working up to snuff, but you don't know how to measure your immune system because it's being controlled over years of your function. These are all parts of this new functional model of how we look at nutrition and physiology. It's a tremendous breakthrough in the way we actually view the effect of what we eat on how our body performs.
I agree with you. The way we eat affects our body is probably a seminal moment for our field. And just to reiterate what you said, food is a potentiator for information. It allows the body's health switches to turn on, which your esteemed colleague, Dr. Mark Hyman, says is the key to longevity. I like to add and piggyback on what you said. I agree with him, but I believe the master switch may be turning on the immune system and allowing it to be resilient and rejuvenative. So I think you made some great points. Also, bioflavonoids have shown to modulate inflammation by inhibiting pro-inflammatory cytokines such as TNF-alpha and interleukin-6. Interleukin-6 from the cytokine is bad. We know from the myokine it's positive, but that's a rabbit hole that I'm not going to ask you to work, go down with me.
Well, hold on just a minute. You said something there I think is really important, because in the past, it was recognized that members of the flavonoid family, specific members like quercetin, rutin, hesperidin, these are names of members of the flavonoid family, that those molecules were capable of lowering inflammation in research studies. But it wasn't. It was expected that how they were working was to block inflammation, like a drug does, like Humira, that blocks inflammation at the level of the immune system by suppressing the immune system. So these were thought maybe to be inflammation inhibiting. But now, with this model of discovery, it's not inflammation inhibiting, it's re-regulating how immune cells produce their effect on the body, not by blocking the downstream of the inflammatory mediator, but regulating how the genes produce those inflammatory mediators by normalizing function. That's a very, very big change in understanding of how this differs from taking a drug. This is not green pharmacy. This is a different molecular cell biology process that was built into our bodies hundreds of millions of years ago. It's the longest clinical study ever done, called natural selection, that gave rise to these properties that these foods have on our body.
Yeah, I think we got to stop and hit that. I think we got to hit the stop button. Emergency break. Here we go. And just, lecturing out there. And I think people need some clarification. People assume that drugs have a different pathway than nutrients like flavonoids, but they don't. They're the same pathways. And as you said, and I'll let you take the baton, they're upstream and downstream effects. So obviously the nutrients are upstream and the drugs are downstream. So baton is passed.
Yeah, I think you said it beautifully there, Dr. Silverman. I really like the way that you've characterized that. Our body has only one set of functional characteristics. It doesn't discriminate between I'm going to have a different set of functions for drugs than I have for diet. When we eat, we're eating biomolecules. We're eating bioactive molecules that influence our physiology through the process of metabolism, which is regulated by our genes from the relationship it has to our diet. Now we learn in the pharmaceutical world that certain of these pathways or these metabolic processes in a disease state are imbalanced or accentuated or absent. And we say, oh, well, I can then fit in a new to nature molecule that has high potency for that specific defect in our metabolism, knowing our metabolism has thousands and thousands of different steps. And I can fit into that, and I can then take over the physiology that is missing. But the physiology that's missing is a consequence of imbalances that have occurred upstream from the way that our genes are regulating those cells. So if we wanted to treat the root cause, we would want to go up and actually do something upstream as to how the body's cells were regulating those downstream production of substances that the drugs were either treating or influencing. And so if we ask, well, how does that happen? It happens all the time, every time we eat. When we eat carbohydrate, we're influencing a whole family of different metabolic pathways, and we think of insulin, but glucagon and all sorts of other hormones are involved in regulating how we take that carbohydrate that we've just eaten that produces glucose in our blood and regulate its disposition into our various cells of our body and ultimately producing energy from which we can live. All of those are regulated by a whole complex series of events, all of which are related to nutrition. We say, well, how about vitamins? Yes. How about minerals? Yes. How about essential fatty acids? Yes. How about essential amino acids? Yes. All those become part of the fabric that regulates how that cell will then convert that process into function.
So again, let food be your medicine, let medicine be your food, rings loud and clear. So basically you're saying is if we eat well, we will negate and decrease the need for drugs, most probably. In addition to that, the idea of maybe putting flavonoids in a dietary supplement comes to mind because you may not have access to all these fruits. You may not have access to organic fruits or fruits that were cared for, because there's a farm problem. There's a soil issue. I know we're going to get to that. So essentially, you made it so interesting about flavonoids. Why take them as a dietary supplement?
I think that there is, again, this or the nutrition gaps that a person has as a consequence of the way they're eating. And this can vary from person to person based upon their specific diets. But what we recognize is that one of the major gaps for people eating the standard American diet or even eating what they think is a marginally good diet is the absence of adequate intake of these flavonoids. In the blue zones, people consume diets that get about 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams a day of the various members of the flavonoids family. In the standard American diet, we get something around 600 milligrams. Most of that comes from coffee, by the way, because coffee and tea both do have flavonoids in them. And so that is the major way that people in our culture in the United States consume flavonoids. But it's not up to the snuff, so to speak, either in the amount or the composition of the array of flavonoids that you get when you look at the diets of people living in the blue zones that live long and healthy. So my feeling is that there can be places to fill the gap with specific types of supplements that have this rich blend of family of flavonoids that are associated with foods that people ate that then associate itself with long life and good health. So you go to those regions of the world, you say, what did they eat? You make a concentrate of those foods, and that becomes then a potential supplement to fill the gap for those needed flavonoids.
All right, here's the story, the conversation of right now. It's hot. I can't even touch it. It's like that hot potato when I was a kid. It's called GLP-1 agonist, Ozempic. And it's not specifically Ozempic, but the story behind how Ozempic works and how flavonoids may be intertwined in using and stimulating the GLP-1 agonist.
Yeah. So GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide-1, is one of the many, many different hormones that regulates how our body uses food. And it controls appetite. It controls metabolic functions as to how energy is broken down. It regulates inflammatory processes, and it influences how insulin works in cells. And so you have to ask, in the natural body, where does GLP-1 come from? And because it's not just a consequence of a drug like Ozempic or Wegovy or Mounjaro that influences GLP-1, this has been with us historically as part of our body's chemistry, as our body's function. And so where is it produced? Well, it turns out it's produced in the small intestine by what are called L cells that reside on the surface of the intestinal tract of our small intestine. And those L cells are triggered to release GLP-1 into our blood after we eat specific types of foods. And lo and behold, as you've already alluded to, those foods are the flavonoid-rich foods. The flavonoid-rich foods, which many of them have kind of a bitter aftertaste, stimulate the receptors on the small intestine, which are called the GLP-1 receptors, that then triggers the release of the hormone GLP-1 into the bloodstream that then circulates throughout the body and has effects on all these organs, like the brain, the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the liver, and it regulates then functions that we start seeing. So now we say what the drug companies do. They found a way to provide supraphysiological levels, very high levels that stay in the blood a lot longer than the natural way that our body would use and produce GLP-1. So now they're producing the very high levels that sustain themselves for hours and hours. And now what it does is it has a pharmacological effect by reducing appetite, improving or enhancing metabolic conversion to energy. And that then becomes this new weight loss drug, kind of revolution that it is speculated that 30 million people in the United States will be taking these drugs within the next few years. 30 million people.
I'm shaking my head at $1,700 a month when they could change that gut microbiome around, add some flavonoids, and help many of them. It's what's interesting. Nature Journal did a study. It was in June, and they used a light to stimulate the dorsal medial part of the hypothalamus to stimulate pre-ingestion satiety. So what's so exciting about what you said about the small intestine is the gut is the epicenter of our health. Here's another great reason to say that, but that gut to brain axis, that superhighway to health, this study really showed. So flavonoids not just don't affect the gut, they also affect the gut to brain axis. So it begs the question, as simple as it is, which foods do you recommend other than my Java, my Elixir Vitae? What do you recommend for people to eat?
Well, it's really interesting because there's all sorts of studies that are now being published that are looking at the GLP-1 agonist, that means stimulant effect of various foods. And as I mentioned, they all turn out to reside in the high flavonoid kind of semi-bitter food category. So you've got bitter melon, mamortica, which we know as a historic food and used in Asia for the treatment of diabetes because its ability to stimulate GLP-1 and its effects on insulin. We know that the hops, common hops, has a really strong GLP-1 activity. We know that a food that we've been studying now for some time, 4,000-year-old food called Himalayan Tartary Buckwheat, which is one of the two oldest foods consumed by humans in the world, which has been lost in America about 200 years ago. We've brought it back into America now, that Himalayan Tartary Buckwheat is a very powerful GLP-1 agonist stimulant and probably says why it has good effects on insulin and glucose tolerance and weight in weight loss programs. We recognize that green tea has ellagic acid and also compounds that are activities that towards stimulating GLP-1. So there are a whole series of foods. I would characterize most of them having some bitter component because it's that bitter taste receptor that is stimulating the body that releases GLP-1. So you can also think about the cruciferous vegetable family, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage having GLP-1 agonist activity. So these are foods that are vegetable foods, and many people don't include them in their diet, and for that reason they have a deficiency of GLP-1 stimulation, and for them they have a different control on their appetite and a different control on their food intake and a different control on their weight. So it all interrelates to this whole concept of body's normal, optimal regulation of itself.
I'll add a few foods: celery, parsley, some herbs, and berries. And let's not forget, please, let's not forget organic dark chocolate.
Yeah, cacao is another GLP-1 agonist for sure. That's a very interesting one to put on the family. But it's interesting to note, Rob, when we think of this, that there are very few macronutrient-rich foods. The foods we've talked about are things that we include in the diet, but we don't actually eat those for sustenance. We eat those as kind of a secondary part of our diet, a berry or a vegetable. It's interesting to note that countries where Himalayan Tartary buckwheat were consumed as a major macronutrient, in other words, a principal in their diet, because it has protein, carbohydrate, fat, it can be used as a food. In those countries, it really serves a wide purpose in regulating insulin, lowering inflammation, improving immune system function. So you get a lot of benefits if you can find something that imparts a significant contribution to your overall diet. This is one of the reasons that we've been very interested in Himalayan Tartary buckwheat sprout powder, because the sprout powder is a very convenient way to get very high levels of these flavonoids that are GLP-1 agonists. A few teaspoons a day of the sprout powder, there's almost like a food as medicine kind of input. And that's what a lot of these cultures did, is to sprout and then use the powder as part of their dietary kind of food as medicine approach.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. It's exciting. I have it in my office. I have it at home. I love the recipes. I'm a pancake guy. You can make pancakes with it. But what's most interesting about it is people ask these questions, and I'll make them very basic. What's the difference between Himalayan Tartary buckwheat and buckwheat?
Yeah. So that is a really good question. First of all, I need to say that the term buckwheat implies that these are members of the wheat family. They're not. They have no relationship. I don't know how the name wheat got into these products, because they're an entirely different species and genus than the grasses that are related to wheat. They're more fruit seeds than they're grains. They're actually not a grain. And so that's number one. Now, what's the difference between common buckwheat, which is Esculatum, versus Tartary buckwheat, which is Tatarticum? The difference is their genes are vastly different. They're about 30% genomic difference between the two. And what that does in the Tartary buckwheat is it allows those seeds, when they germinate, to produce something like 50 to 100 times, not percent, 50 to 100 times the level of these immune and health promoting flavonoids to that of common buckwheat. So these are like biochemical factories producing this rich array, orchestration of this family, over 50 different flavonoids that are produced by this plant in very, very high levels. Over 2% of their weight are these immune active flavonoids. So people who ate this food historically, that lived in the Himalayan region of China, were individuals who were characterized by having very, very strong immune systems. They didn't take antibiotics. They didn't have modern medicine, but they were members of this longevity community, in part, I don't want to say solely, but in part as a consequence of the really extraordinary benefit that this plant has, this plant food. And the reason this plant food probably evolved is it grew up in a very hostile area of the world, in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. And to survive over time, its genes had to become very immune rich, because plants have immune systems. And so it selected for the immune characteristics of the plant that would allow it to survive under these very hostile conditions, frost and then high temperatures, drought, bad soils. So it has the ability with its own immune system to defend itself against hostile environments. and it passes that immune virtue onto people who eat it. So the immune system activity of the plant becomes the support of the immune system of us as humans. It's a really interesting story of the cycle of life, basically.
So let's take this a step further, HTB. Let's do a little rapid fire for everybody. Is it gluten-free?
Yeah, HTB, Himalayan Tartary Buckwheat, as a consequence of being a member of the buckwheat family, is gluten-free. And again, as I said, I don't know why wheat is in the name. It shouldn't be. It has no relationship to gluten-containing grains.
Is it dairy-free? Is it vegan?
Yeah, it's absolutely vegan. It's very high protein. It's really interesting in that of all the kind of sources of nutrition you can get from different starch sources, the protein content in Himalayan Tartary buckwheat is high, and it's very high in essential amino acids. It's also high in gamma aminobutyric acid, which is really very helpful for nervous system function. It is very high in resistant starch, so it has a very strong prebiotic effect. It has a very moderate effect on blood sugar. In fact, it stabilizes blood sugar. So its characteristics is almost like you would design if you want to design a superfood. It has all those characteristics.
It has over 100 immune enhancing nutrients leading to immune enhancing properties. It's quite exciting. Now, there's a little backstory to it because we talk a lot about rejuvenative type of soils in agriculture, and I think that HTP really ties that all together. So could you expand on that a little bit? Because I am going around telling everybody there's only 7% of the soil that's left to be organic. We're done with this and that. And that statement may no longer be correct.
Well, I, like you, got very concerned about what we were doing in our soil husbandry and our agriculture methodology. And that led me through this whole discovery process, ultimately into Himalayan Tartary buckwheat, which I never expected in my life I would ultimately be involved with owning farms, but that's what happened. We ended up with a wonderful cooperative group of farmers growing Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. We're the first people in the United States, I think, to grow organic and now regenerative agriculture certified Himalayan Tartary buckwheat up in the Buffalo, New York area. And we like the cold climates. It's really good for our plants. They like it cold when the seeds are planted and then warm in the summer. And so we've really started to learn about agricultural methods, and then we've learned about the relationship of our soil ecology to that of the production of these immune strengthening nutrients in the plant. And so we have a soil scientist, Dr. Emily Reese, who got her PhD from Cornell, who now is our soil steward, our soil wizard. We do soil analysis. We've discovered a way of inoculating the soil with mycorrhiza, specific types of fungi and bacteria that improve the health of the soil, which then we find improves the production of the immune strengthening nutrients in our Himalayan Tartary buckwheat. So we have a whole agricultural process that is kind of ours, kind of unique, and then we do it regeneratively, so that we are, re-nourishing the soil in the process of this whole production of this final product.
Outstanding. So if anybody's interested, I'm going to add a little code where they can get the HTB. It'll be from Big Bold Health, which leads to our last question, because I know your time is very limited. I appreciate you taking the time to come on, talking with me, always giving me a chance to shine just a little bit. You're the president of Big Bold Health. What's next for Big Bold Health?
Yeah, so we've focused Big Bold Health really, and the whole reason the company was formed was to try to understand how to improve personal immune health. And we did this right before COVID-19. I had no idea that immune health would become the dominant concern that we have. And so for the last few years, we've really been trying to dig deep and do a deep dive into understanding how our lifestyle, diet, and things that are in our environment influence our immune health, and how we harness that information to lead to better immune resilience, so that people who are exposed to things won't end up sick, like happened with COVID-19. And so we're really now doing clinical work and basic science research. We just have published a paper that I'm very excited about, in which we were able to show the effects of these Himalayan Tartary Buckwheat flavonoids on reducing immune inflammatory response and improving immune. Actually, we were able to roll back immune aging by 47% in 90 days of supplementation with these HTB flavonoids. I think it's the first work of this type ever been done, and it's being published in a peer-reviewed high-tier journal. So we think we're making fundamental contributions to the body of science that hopefully will raise the bar for a lot of other people, and we can really get on board to strengthen people's immune system, and not to boost, because we don't want to boost immune systems that are imbalanced. We want to normalize immune systems to provide better resilience, and that's what we feel this immunorejuvenation process that we're exploring and discovering will allow us to do. So we're very excited about the future. For me, this is like being reborn again, and a whole new focus of my energy. And I'm just very pleased to have this remarkable group of colleagues that are on this task with me with Big Bold Health.
That's outstanding. I mean, I talked to you 10 years ago, and I mean, we've talked other times, but you know, I was looking at you and I said, this gentleman may have an AARP card, but he is not stopping. I mean, I see you coming up on your 100th birthday and giving a lecture to some 25-year-old erudites and just changing the way they see the world, just like you've changed so many people's worlds. I can't tell you how much I personally appreciate you taking the time, how much I appreciate you making my life better and allowing me to continue on a mission to help people in a healthful way. Everybody, the father of functional medicine, check him out, Dr. Jeffrey Bland. Rob Silverman, Proven Health Alternatives.